story of Moses and the burning bush to the acacia bush and the acacia tree, which is rich.
In 1958, the biggest movie studio in Hollywood found itself in a bind. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had already poured $15 million into a biblical epic so enormous it demanded the largest film set ever built, 18 acres standing in for a Roman arena, 2,500 horses, and yet every major leading man in town had already turned the project down. Burt Lancaster called the script dull. Paul Newman joked he didn't have the legs for a tunic. Kirk Douglas actually wanted the part and got passed over anyway. So the studio turned instead to a man who'd spent his childhood alone in the Michigan wilderness, performing scenes from books for an audience of nothing but trees. A man whose future wife had turned down his marriage proposal more than once before finally agreeing. A man who'd once posed for art students and operated an elevator just to keep the lights on in a freezing apartment with no hot water. His name was Charlton Heston, and almost nobody expected a backwoods kid from a one-room Michigan schoolhouse to become one of the greatest epic film stars in Hollywood history. Here are 10 moments that proved everyone wrong. Number 10. The Boy Who Talked to Trees. On October 4, 1923, in an unincorporated stretch of land between Evanston and Wilmette, Illinois, a boy named John Charles Carter was born. His father, Russell, ran a lumber mill, while his grandfather, John Carter, had built a career in real estate and founded a magazine called Carter's Weekly, later sold and rebranded as Red Book, a woman's magazine still in circulation today. While John Charles was still an infant, his father's work relocated the family to St. Helen, Michigan, a remote, densely wooded town tucked into eastern Roscommon County, and there, inside a modest two-story house surrounded by pine trees and silence, the boy essentially vanished into the wilderness. He attended a one-room schoolhouse, hunted deer alongside his father, not for sport, but because meat was scarce and money scarcer, fished the local lakes, and chopped wood for the kitchen stove. Once his chores were finished, he'd do something that would end up shaping the rest of his life. He'd wander alone into the woods and start acting out characters from whatever books he'd been reading. Hour after hour, day after day, this solitary boy performed Shakespeare and adventure tales for an audience of birch trees and white-tailed deer. He later wrote that his earliest memory was digging in the sandy Michigan soil with a small red toy shovel, but his truest memory was pretending. And one day, standing in those quiet woods, something clicked. He'd later put it this way: he realized that this childhood game of make-believe was something adults actually did too, on a stage. Number 9. The Wound That Never Fully Closed. When John Charles turned 10, his world fell apart. His parents divorced, and decades later, long after he'd won an Academy Award, parted the Red Sea on screen, and survived World War II, Charlton Heston would say, without hesitation, that his parents' divorce was, in his own words, the single most traumatic experience of his life, more than the war itself. Sit with that for a second. A man who'd flown combat missions as a radio operator and aerial gunner aboard B-25 bombers said nothing in that war compared to the day his family broke apart. His mother, Lilla, married a man named Chester Heston, and the family relocated back to the Chicago suburbs, settling in Wilmette, Illinois. The children took their stepfather's surname, and almost overnight, John Charles Carter became Charlton Heston, a quiet, awkward teenager who'd traded the vast Michigan wilderness for a crowded suburban high school where he knew absolutely no one. He missed his old life. He felt out of place, a backwoods kid dropped into a world of sidewalks and streetlights. But New Trier High School offered something the Michigan woods never could: a drama program, and the moment Heston stepped onto that stage, everything shifted. Number 8. The Woman Who Kept Saying No. At New Trier, Heston threw himself fully into theater, and it turned out he wasn't just good, he was exceptional. A young filmmaker named David Bradley cast him in the lead of an amateur 16mm silent adaptation of Henrik Ibsen's Peer Gynt, released in 1941, marking Heston's very first appearance on film. His talent earned him a drama scholarship to Northwestern University, where he immersed himself in classical literature and stagecraft, and it was there that he met a fellow drama student named Lydia Marie Clark. He fell for her instantly. She did not fall for him. He proposed, she said no. He proposed again, she said no again. For 2 full years, Heston pursued the woman he loved, and for 2 years she turned him down, until World War II intervened. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces, trained as a radio operator and aerial gunner assigned to B-25 bombers, and before shipping out, he wrote to Lydia one final time, likely bracing for the same answer he'd always gotten. This time, something changed. She said yes. They married in a small North Carolina church in March of 1944. A marriage that would last 64 years until the day he died, one of the longest marriages in Hollywood history, and it began with a woman who spent 2 years telling him no. Number 7. The Cold Water Flat. After 2 years stationed in the Aleutian Islands as a radio operator and gunner, Heston came home to Lydia with one shared dream, making it as actors. So they packed up and moved to New York City, renting a cold water walk-up in Hell's Kitchen, a place with no hot water, a radiator that barely functioned, and money that ran out fast. Heston posed for art classes so students could sketch him for a few dollars an hour, worked as an elevator operator, while Lydia took whatever work she could find, and every night he auditioned for anything available. Broadway was flooded with returning veterans chasing the same dream, and the competition was brutal. Rejection stacking on rejection. There was one particular night early in that struggle when Heston stood in that freezing apartment with his wife, both of them broke and exhausted, having to decide whether to keep pushing or give up and go home. He chose to keep going. In 1947, he landed a small role in a Broadway production of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, not a lead role, but when the production toured nationally, it put Heston on the radar of casting directors around the country. He began picking up roles in live television dramas like Studio One and Suspense, putting his face in front of millions of American viewers for the first time. And one of those viewers happened to be legendary producer Hal Wallace, the man behind Casablanca. Watching Heston on that small black and white screen, Wallace saw something no one else had and offered him a film contract. In 1950, Heston made his Hollywood debut in the film noir Dark City, playing a gambler on the run from gangsters. He was 30 years old, had been acting for nearly a decade, and outside a handful of TV viewers and one Broadway audience, still no one really knew his name. That was about to change. Number 6. Becoming the Face of Moses. In 1952, director Cecil DeMille cast Heston in The Greatest Show on Earth, a Technicolor circus drama that went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, a solid hit in its own right. But DeMille had something far bigger already in motion, a remake of his own 1923 silent film, The Ten Commandments, now envisioned as a massive VistaVision epic, filmed on location in Egypt with 14,000 extras and 15,000 animals, and he needed his Moses. DeMille considered William Boyd, better known as Hopalong Cassidy, but Boyd declined.
Then DeMille did something remarkable. He held up a photograph of Michelangelo's marble statue of Moses from the church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, looked at the statue, looked at Heston, and said, "That is the face of Moses." Heston got the role and threw himself into it with an intensity that stunned the entire production. He didn't just play Moses, he became him, even personally requesting to voice God in the burning bush scene, a request DeMille granted, while Heston's own infant son, Fraser, was cast as baby Moses in the basket on the Nile. During filming, the 75-year-old DeMille suffered a serious heart attack after climbing 130 feet to inspect a malfunctioning camera, took just 2 days off, and returned to finish the film against his doctor's orders. The Ten Commandments premiered on November 8, 1956, and became a sensation, costing over $13 million and grossing $90 million. Almost overnight, Charlton Heston went from a working actor to a bona fide international star. And that was still just the beginning. Number 5. Stay in the Chariot. When director William Wyler began casting Ben-Hur in 1957, Heston wasn't even on his list. Lancaster passed, Newman passed, Douglas was turned down, and only after every major leading man in Hollywood had said no did Wyler finally turn to Heston, formally casting him on January 22, 1958, for a salary of $250,000. Then the real work began. The chariot race was set to be the centerpiece of the entire film, and Yakima Kanat, the greatest stuntman in Hollywood history, was brought in to coordinate it, training Heston for months, hours every day, teaching him to drive a 4-horse chariot team at a full gallop. The horses, mostly Lipizzaner stallions imported from Yugoslavia, trained for up to 6 months, learning to pull first individually, then in pairs, then in threes, and finally as complete teams at full speed. The arena, built at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, spanned 18 acres, the largest single film set ever constructed, with over 1,000 workers spending more than a year building it. When filming day finally arrived, Heston was genuinely terrified, telling Kanat that up until then, it had only ever been the 2 of them training together, and now there'd be 8 other teams in the arena at once. Kanat's response became legendary: "Chuck, you just stay in the chariot." They shot the race over 5 weeks. The finished sequence runs just over 9 minutes, filmed with 0 digital effects or green screens. The crashes entirely real, the danger entirely real. Stuntman Joe Kanat, Yakima's own son, was actually thrown from his chariot during filming, and the footage turned out so spectacular that Wyler kept it in the final cut. 4,000 extras watched from the stands and didn't need any prompting to cheer, roaring like a stadium crowd as the chariots thundered past. On April 4, 1960, Ben-Hur swept 11 Academy Awards, a record that stood for nearly 4 decades, with Heston himself winning Best Actor. When a reporter asked backstage which scene he'd enjoyed filming most, Heston replied flatly that he hadn't enjoyed any of it, that it had simply been hard work, then turned to Wyler and joked that this must be old hat for him by now. Wyler, already a 3-time winner, told him it never gets old. Number 4. The man who marched before it was fashionable. By the early 1960s, Charlton Heston had become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, and he could have easily played it safe, stayed quiet, and protected his career. Instead, he did something that stunned the entire industry. In May of 1961, Charlton Heston traveled to Oklahoma City and personally joined a picket line at a segregated lunch counter, a genuinely risky move for a white leading man in Hollywood at that time, but Heston didn't hesitate. 2 years later, on August 28, 1963, he went even further, boarding a chartered flight alongside Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, Burt Lancaster, and dozens of other Hollywood figures, heading to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As president of the Screen Actors Guild at the time, Heston led the Hollywood delegation himself. Before the group left Los Angeles, Brando reportedly held up a cattle prod that had been used against demonstrators in Alabama and pushed for the group to chain themselves to the Lincoln Memorial in protest. Heston refused, insisting they follow the established rules of the march, and Brando ultimately backed down, letting things proceed Heston's way. That afternoon, Charlton Heston stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and watched Martin Luther King Jr. deliver what would become the most famous speech in American history. Asked years later why he chose to march, Heston explained that, like most Americans up to that point, he'd mainly voiced support for civil rights at cocktail parties. But that summer, he could no longer offer only lip service to a cause he believed was so urgently right at a moment that felt so urgently overdue. After he died in 2008, scholar Earl O'Farry Hutchinson noted that Heston had supported the rights of racial minorities well before it was fashionable within Hollywood, crediting him for his significant contributions to the civil rights movement. Number 2. You Maniacs. In 1968, producer Arthur Jacobs brought Heston an unusual pitch, a science fiction film about an astronaut who crash lands on a planet ruled by intelligent, talking apes. The premise sounded absurd on paper, and no studio wanted to touch it, but Heston saw something in the material that others had missed, later saying he was drawn to the idea of talking apes and an entirely different civilization. The screenplay came from Rod Serling, creator of The Twilight Zone, who added a twist ending that hadn't existed in the original novel the film was based on. Before approving any budget, though, the studio needed proof that audiences would take actors in ape prosthetics seriously rather than laugh them off the screen. So the production filmed a makeup test, with Heston and 2 other actors performing a dramatic scene in full ape makeup. Studio executives watched, nobody laughed, and the film got the green light. Filming took place across the deserts of California, Utah, and Arizona in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, with the actors playing apes spending 3 to 4 hours each morning having foam latex pieces glued to their faces. Later, Heston called it the most physically demanding role of his entire career, one that saw him whipped, hosed down with a fire hose, caged, stripped, and dragged through dirt. One detail reveals just how convincing the illusion actually was. His co-star, Kim Hunter, played the chimpanzee scientist Zira for months, and when Heston finally saw her without the makeup, he didn't recognize her at all, having spent months acting across from a woman whose real face he'd never actually seen. But the true power of Planet of the Apes lived in its closing moments. The ending was kept tightly under wraps that audiences had no idea what was coming. In the film's final scene, Heston's astronaut, George Taylor, rides along a desolate beach beside his mute companion, Nova, then spots something rising out of the sand, the shattered remains of the Statue of Liberty. Taylor collapses to his knees, and Heston delivers one of the most iconic lines in film history, cursing what had become of the world he thought he'd escaped. The art director later revealed that that final storyboard had originally been sketched on the back of a bar napkin. Planet of the Apes went on to become one of the highest-grossing films of 1968 and launched a franchise that continues today. Number 2. From My Cold, Dead Hands.
In the decades that followed, Charlton Heston underwent one of the most striking political transformations in American public life. The man who had marched alongside Martin Luther King, picketed segregated lunch counters, and campaigned for Adlai Stevenson in 1956 and John F. Kennedy in 1960, became one of the most prominent conservative voices in the country. He switched political parties in 1987, and when asked to explain the shift, his answer was simple. He hadn't changed, the culture around him had. In 1998, he was elected president of the National Rifle Association, and on May 20, 2000, at the NRA's annual convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, he delivered the moment that would come to define his public image in later life. Speaking out against Al Gore's gun control platform during that year's presidential race, Heston reached behind the podium at the climax of his speech and produced a replica colonial-era musket, raising it above his head and declaring, in that same commanding voice that had once played Moses and parted seas, that they'd have to take it from his cold, dead hands. The line itself wasn't his invention, having already appeared on NRA bumper stickers years earlier, but Heston is the one who made it immortal. The moment drew cheers from millions and condemnation from millions more, cementing him as one of the most polarizing figures in American culture. 2 years later, documentary filmmaker Michael Moore arrived at his front door with a camera crew for Bowling for Columbine, and the resulting encounter was uncomfortable to watch, with Heston already showing early signs of cognitive decline, visibly struggling under Moore's aggressive questioning before eventually standing up and walking away. It was a difficult moment for a man who'd spent his entire life standing firm. But whether people loved him or hated him, Charlton Heston never once apologized for what he believed. Number 1. The Long Goodbye. In August of 2002, Charlton Heston sat down in front of a camera to record a message for the world. He was 78 years old, and his voice, the same powerful instrument that had once spoken as Moses and cursed the fall of civilization, had grown quieter, slower. He announced that he'd been diagnosed with symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease, a cruel ending for a man who had built his entire life around words. The voice that once parted the Red Sea was going silent. The mind that had memorized Shakespeare, scripture, and countless speeches was slowly dissolving. The disease gradually took his memory, his speech, and eventually his ability to recognize the people he loved. But one thing never wavered through all of it. Lydia stayed by his side, the same woman who had turned down his proposals again and again back at Northwestern, who had finally said yes right before he shipped out to war, who had shared that freezing walk-up apartment in Hell's Kitchen when they had nothing at all. She never left him, not for a single day. Their marriage lasted 64 years, and in a town where marriages so often don't survive, Charlton and Lydia Heston stayed together through everything. Through fame and controversy, through Oscar wins and public protests, through standing ovations and angry picket lines. They both battled cancer, and both came through it. And when the one battle came that couldn't be won, Lydia fought it right alongside him. On April 5, 2008, Charlton Heston died at his home in Beverly Hills at the age of 84. President George W. Bush, who had awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom back in 2003, called him an extraordinary American. But perhaps the truest tribute came from Heston himself. In a reflective moment years earlier, he'd written about the place that shaped who he became, marveling that only in America could a lanky country kid named Charlton rise out of anonymity in the Michigan Northwoods and build a life that actually mattered. He was born John Charles Carter on a forgotten stretch of Illinois farmland. He grew up talking to trees in the Michigan wilderness. His parents' divorce broke something in him. The woman he loved kept saying no. He drove an elevator and posed for sketching classes just to get by. And then he became Moses. He became Ben-Hur. He stood beside Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He cried out at the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. He raised a musket over his head and dared anyone to take it from him. And in the end, he faced the one opponent that even Charlton Heston couldn't defeat. But he faced it exactly the way he faced everything else in his extraordinary life, standing tall, looking it directly in the eye, and refusing to look away. He was Charlton Heston, and there will never be another one like him.